Wholesome Appalachia, Episode 8, Sergeant York. Hey y'all, I'm Heather, and this is not Poison Appalachia, it's Wholesome Appalachia. Once a month, we'll take a walk on the brighter side of Appalachia because there's a lot of good things that happen in Appalachia. I'm just drawn more to the darker side of things. So the third Friday of every month, we'll have a bonus episode. Today, I want to talk about Sergeant Alvin York. I remember seeing this movie on TV years ago with my parents, but didn't really watch it. I really didn't even know he was a real person until years later, and just recently, I read a story about him on Facebook, and I thought he would make a good person for Wholesome Appalachia. And since July is a patriotic month, who better to talk about than Sergeant York? Disclaimer, this episode talks a lot about Christianity because it's a central part of his story. I consider religion to be like politics. I don't really want to discuss it on this podcast. Like, whatever you believe is what you believe, and that's great. And we can all believe different things or believe nothing, and that's great. So I do try to stay clear talking about it, but like I said, it's a central part to this story, so if you're not into Christianity and don't want to hear about it, I would suggest skipping this episode. But it's an interesting story, I think. Sergeant York was an American soldier who was one of the most decorated United States Army soldiers of World War I, and he was a pacifist who almost was a conscientious objector. How does that even work together, you may ask? Well, let's find out about him. Alvin Colum York was born in a two-bedroom log cabin in Fentress County, Tennessee. He was the third child born to William Uriah York and Mary Elizabeth Brooks York. William Uriah York was born in Jamestown, Tennessee, to Uriah York and Eliza Jane Livingston, who had moved to Tennessee from Buncombe County, North Carolina. Mary Elizabeth York was born in Pall Mall to William Brooks, who took his mother's maiden name as an alias of William H. Harrington after deserting from Company A of the 11th Michigan Cavalry Regiment during the American Civil War. And Nancy Pyle was the great-granddaughter of Conrad Pyle, an English settler who settled Pall Mall, Tennessee. Pall Mall is just a tiny little place. It's a small unincorporated community in the Wolf River Valley of Fentress County, Tennessee. It's named after Pall Mall, London. Pall Mall is located near the Kentucky-Tennessee state line in northeastern central Tennessee. The population was at 1,398 people according to the 2000 census. So Alvin Colum York was born in Pall Mall, Tennessee on December 13, 1887 into a family of farmers. He was the third of 11 children and the oldest boy of William and Mary Brooks York. The Yorks struggled in poverty, which only worsened when York's father died in 1911. York only had 9 months of schooling, but had gained a variety of skills exploring and hunting for game in the mountains of Tennessee. York became a skilled marksman and continued to work his jobs around Pall Mall to support his family. The 11 York children had minimal schooling because they helped provide for the family, including hunting, fishing, and working as laborers. The stress of supporting his family was difficult. People in town considered him a nuisance, in part due to his tendency to lose money. After the death of his father, York assisted in caring for his younger siblings and found work as a blacksmith. Despite being a regular churchgoer, York also drank heavily and was prone to fistfights. His mother belonged to a church that promoted Christian pacifism, and though he was reportedly fond of drinking and a good scrap, he often attended church. York's religion became not only genuine, but also ardent, especially after a New Year's Day 1915 sermon from a visiting preacher left him feeling as if lightning struck his soul. He abandoned the moonshine and brawling and soon became an assistant pastor. After the conversion experience, he vowed to improve and become even more devoted to the Church of Christ in Christian. A little bit about the Church of Christ in Christian Union. The Churches of Christ in Christian Union, CCCU, is a Wesleyan holiness and restorationist Christian denomination. The CCCU has a presence in 15 states and several nations with about 200 churches in the United States. Ohio Christian University is its educational wing with denominational world headquarters nearby, just outside Circleville, Ohio. The Churches of Christ and Christian Union became a separate denomination in 1909 when 5 ministers and about 60 lay people were separated from the steadily declining Christian Union headquartered in Ohio. While the Christian Union was originally formed in 1864 to protest the Methodist Episcopal Church's support of the American Civil War, the CCCU was forged by a dispute over doctrine in 1909. Those holding to a Wesleyan view on sanctification were censured by the leadership of the South Ohio Conference of the Christian Union during a period of time when many other holiness movement supporters were at loggerheads within established denominations. So I really don't know much about the church, but they were definitely against war and killing, and that was a strong tenet in their beliefs. The Restoration movement, which includes the Churches of Christ, had strong pacifist roots in the 19th century. Figures like Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone, key figures in the movement, initially emphasized a pacifist stance advocating for nonviolence and separation from worldly affairs. Over time, the Churches of Christ, particularly in the South, experienced a shift towards a more nationalistic and militaristic stance, especially during and after World War I, partially due to societal and government pressures. Which leads us back to Alvin York and his story. By 1917, World War I was on its third year, already claiming millions of lives and leaving massive destruction across Europe. Stories of the hellish fighting in Europe reached the United States, and many, including York, had heard of the horrors of the battlefields. With the United States entry into World War I, the government had decided to use the draft to raise its fighting forces to send to Europe. Though he wanted no part of the war, York had to sign up for the draft like millions of other American men. On June 5, 1917, he received the notice that he had been selected for military service. York now faced the difficult decision of choosing to fight, which went against his religious beliefs, or choosing not to fight and being arrested. He tried to file for an exemption as a conscientious objector, someone who opposes military service due to moral or religious beliefs. Even with the testimonial from his pastor, York's appeal was denied 3 times because his church was not recognized as an official sect of Christianity. He reported to Camp Gordon, Georgia, now Fort Gordon, in the fall of 1917, where he continued to explain his predicament and avoid contradicting his beliefs. Assigned to the 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Infantry Division, York proved himself a skilled marksman, but still struggled with the order to fight. His disciplined living and superior shooting ability saw him promoted, but he still grappled with his pacifism, which he discussed with 2 very religious superior officers, who worked to convince him that one could both follow the Bible and kill for one's nation. But as word spread about York's pacifist tendencies, other soldiers began to ostracize him and openly ridicule him. He appealed the order to his battalion commander, Major Edward Buxton. Instead of instantly denying him, Buxton and York spent hours talking and referencing Bible passages that supported each other's views. York left that meeting still a soldier and just as confused. Major Edward Buxton, a devout Christian himself, read to him biblical passages about violence. He that hath no sword, let him sell his cloak and buy one. Render unto Caesar. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight. Persuaded to York to reconsider the mortality of his participation in the war. After discussions with his commander, who also discussed biblical passages related to duty and the use of force, York was granted a 10-day leave to visit home. He spent this time in prayer and reflecting on his faith and the conflict between his beliefs and the country's call to arms. He ultimately concluded that he could serve in the military while remaining true to his conscience, finding a way to balance his faith with his duty. After days of prayer and reflection, he made the decision to follow orders and fight. York decided that if he still followed the right path in his soul, no matter the path God set out for him, he would be judged a good man. The period of reflection allowed him to reach a nuanced understanding of his circumstances where he could participate in the military without feeling he was betraying his core beliefs. He returned as committed to his new mission as he had been to pacifism, convinced that God meant him to fight and would keep him safe. Though he still opposed the war, he returned to Camp Gordon to prepare for deployment to Europe. York arrived in France on June 27, 1918, and immediately went to the front. The Army assigned his unit to the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest American operation of the war. On October 8, 1918, Private First Class Acting Corporal York and his unit of 16 soldiers were dispatched to capture Decauville Railroad. Unfortunately, their map was in French, and the detachment ended up behind enemy lines where they ran into a German unit on guard. York and his unit won a brief firefight and captured the enemy soldiers. However, the captured Germans soon discovered the Americans' mistake and yelled out for help. Any machine gun fire immediately cut down 9 American soldiers. York wrote in a diary that he always carried with him about the incident. The Germans got us, and they got us right smart. They just stopped us dead in our tracks. Their machine guns were up there and on the heights overlooking us and well hidden. And we couldn't tell for certain where their terrible heavy fire was coming from. And I'm telling you, they were shooting straight. Our boys just went down like long grass before the mowing machine at home. Our attack just faded out, and there we were, lying down about halfway across the valley, and those German machine guns and big shells had getting us hard. And those machine guns were spitting fire and cutting down the undergrowth all around me, something awful, and the Germans were yelling orders. You never heard such a racket in all your life. I didn't have time to dodge behind a tree. I began to exchange shots with them. There were over 30 of them in continuous action, and all I could do was touch the Germans off just as fast as I could. I was sharpshooting. All the times I kept yelling at them to come down. I didn't want to kill any more than I had to, but it was they or I, and I was giving them the best I had. After losing all their sergeants, York took command of the unit. As York witnessed the death of wounding of several in his unit, he saw that he must fight and kill in order to prevent further bloodshed among his fellow American soldiers. The remaining men returned fire while York took on the machine gun alone. Having crossed his moral dilemma, plenty of physical obstacles remained, such as charging up a hill against the machine gun fire. At one point, York was facing 19 German soldiers, some sources say 18, by himself. Unfazed, the crack marksman killed them all. York used the skills he had learned hunting in the mountains of Tennessee to work his way toward the guns, slowly and calmly, approaching the enemy position. A second wave of German soldiers desperately charged him with the bayonets. York shot them down. He defeated the attackers without getting hit and reached the machine gun nest. York eliminated the machine gun, and the German commander decided to surrender instead of losing any more men. At this point, a German lieutenant, deeply affected by the agony and pleading of his fellow officers, blew a whistle and ordered the remaining soldiers in his battalion to surrender. Imperial German Army First Lieutenant Paul Jürgen Vollmer, commanding the 120th Reserve Infantry Regiment's 1st Battalion, emptied his pistol trying to kill York while he was contending with the machine guns. Failing to injure York and seeing his mounting losses, he offered in English to surrender the unit to York, who accepted. At the end of the engagement, York and his 7 men marched their German prisoners back to the American lines. Upon returning to his unit, York reported to his commander, Brigadier General Julian Robert Lindsay, who remarked, "Well, York, I hear you've captured the whole German army." York replied, "No, sir, I only got 132. York's actions silenced the German machine guns and were responsible for enabling the 32nd Infantry to renew its attack to capture the Decauville Railroad. When York marched the 132 prisoners and the remainder of his squad back to his astounded commanding officer in this battle, he also said that in this battle that made his name a synonym for wartime courage. York reported that he never got a scratch. York was immediately promoted to sergeant and became a national hero. York also received the Distinguished Service Cross. A few months later, an investigation by York's chain of command resulted in an upgrade of his Distinguished Service Cross to Medal of Honor, which was presented by the commanding general of the American Expeditionary Forces, General John J. Pershing. The French Republic awarded him the Croix de Guerre, Médaille Militaire, and Legion of Honor. In addition to his French medals, Italy awarded York the Croce de Mer... I don't know, these are all hard to read. The Croce al Merito di Guerra, and the Montenegro decorated him with his war medal. He eventually received over 50 decorations. York's Medal of Honor citation reads, "After his platoon suffered heavy casualties and 3 other non-commissioned officers had become casualties, Corporal York assumed command, fearlessly leading 7 men. He charged his great daring machine gun nest, which was pouring deadly and incessant fire upon his platoon. In this heroic feat, the machine gun nest was taken, together with 4 officers and 128 men and several guns." In attempting to explain his actions during the 1919 investigation that resulted in the Medal of Honor, York told General Lindsay, "A higher power than me guided me and watched over me and told me what to do." Lindsay replied, "York, you're right." York received a number of awards for his actions, which I mentioned a bit ago. The unscathed hero also received high military honors from the Allied nations. Before leaving France, York was his division's non-commissioned officer delegate to the caucus, which created the American Legion, of which York was a charter member. York's heroism went unnoticed in the United States press, even in Tennessee, until the publication of the April 26, 1919 issue of Saturday Evening Post, which had a circulation of in excess of 2 million. In an article titled "The Second Elder Gives Battle," journalist George Patullo, who had learned of York's story while touring the battlefields earlier in the year, laid out the themes that have dominated York's story ever since. The mountaineer, his religious faith and skill with firearms, patriotic, plain-spoken, and unsophisticated, an uneducated man who seems to do everything correctly by intuition. In response, the Tennessee Society, a group of Tennesseans living in New York City, arranged celebrations to greet York upon his return to the United States, including a 5-day furlough to allow his visits to New York City and Washington, D.C. York arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey on May 22nd, stayed at the Waldorf Astoria, and attended a formal banquet in his honor. He toured the subway system in a special car before continuing to Washington, where the House of Representatives gave him a standing ovation, and he met Secretary of War Newton D. Baker and the President's Secretary, Joe Tumulty, as President Wilson was still in Paris. York proceeded to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, where he was discharged from the service, and then to Tennessee for more celebrations. He had been home for barely a week on June 7, 1919. York and Gracie Loretta Williams were married by Tennessee Governor Albert H. Brooks in Pall Mall. More celebrations followed the wedding, including a week-long trip to Nashville, where York accepted a special medal awarded by the state. York refused many offers to profit from his fame, including thousands of dollars offered for appearances, product endorsements, newspaper articles, and movie rights to his life story. Instead, he lent his name to various charitable and civic causes. To support economic development, he campaigned for the Tennessee government to build a road of service to his native region. He succeeded when a highway through the mountains were completed in the mid-1920s and named Alvin C. York Highway. The Nashville Rotary organized the purchase by public subscription of a 400-acre farm, the one gift that York accepted. However, it was not a fully equipped farm he was promised, requiring York to borrow money to stock it. He subsequently lost money in the farming depression that followed the war. Then the Rotary was unable to continue the installment payments on the property, leaving York to pay them himself. In 1921, he had no option but to seek public help, resulting in an extended discussion of his finances in the press, some of it sharply critical. Debt in itself was a trial. I could get used to most any kind of hardship, but I'm not fitted for hardship of owing money. Only an appeal to Rotary clubs nationwide and account of York's plight in the New York world brought the required contributions by Christmas of 1921. For a long time, York remained active in raising money for his Tennessee region, while many residents lived below the poverty line. In the 1920s, York formed the Alvin C. York Foundation with the mission of increasing educational opportunities in his region of Tennessee. Board members included the area's Congressman Cordell Hull, who later became Secretary of State under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Secretary of the Treasury William G. McAdoo, who was President Wilson's son-in-law, and Tennessee Governor Albert Roberts. Plans called for a non-sectarian institution providing vocational training to be called the York Agricultural Institute. York concentrated on fundraising, though he disappointed audiences who wanted to hear about his time in Argonne when he insisted that I occupied one space in a 50-mile front. I saw so little it hardly seems worthwhile discussing it. I'm trying to forget the war in the interest of the mountain boys and girls that I grew up among. He fought first to win financial support from the state and county, then battled local leaders about the school's location. Refusing to compromise, he resigned and developed plans for a rival York industrial school. After a series of lawsuits, he gained control of the original institution and was its president when it opened in December 1929. As the Great Depression deepened, the state government failed to provide promised funds, and York mortgaged his farm to fund bus transportation for students. Even after he was ousted as president in 1936 by political and bureaucratic rivals, he continued to donate money. In 1935, York, sensing the end of his time at the Institute, began to work as a project superintendent with the Civilian Conservation Corps, overseeing the creation of Cumberland Mountain State Park's Bird Lake, one of the largest masonry projects the program has ever undertook. York served as the park's superintendent until 1940. In the second half of the 1930s and early 1940s, in the run-up to America's entry into World War II, York was a forceful and public advocate for interventionism, calling for the U.S. involvement in the war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. At the time, U.S. public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of the isolationist and non-interventionist approach, and York's unpopular views led to accusations he was engaged in warmongering. York became a relatively rare, high-profile public voice for intervention. In his speech at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in May 1941, York said, "We must fight again. The time is not now ripe, nor will it ever be, to compromise with Hitler, or with the things he stands for." York's speeches attracted the attention of President Roosevelt, who frequently quoted York, particularly a passage from York's Tomb of the Unknown Soldier speech. "By our victory in the last war, we won a lease on liberty, and not a deed to it. Now, after 23 years, Adolf Hitler tells us that the lease is expiring, and after the manner of all leases, we have the privilege of renewing it, or letting it go by default. We are standing at the crossroads of history. The important capitals of the world in a few years will be either Berlin and Moscow, or Washington and London. I, for one, prefer Congress and Parliament to Hitler's Reichstag and Stalin's Kremlin. And because we were, for a time, side by side, I know the unknown soldier does too. We owe it to him to renew that lease of liberty he helped us to get." York stayed out of the spotlight until Hollywood screenwriters finally convinced him to make a film about his story. He wanted to tell the story of his life after the war and work he had done at home. Despite the desire, Sergeant York was released in 1941 and focused on his time in France, starring Gary Cooper. Sergeant York became one of the highest-grossing films in the United States during World War II. During World War II, York attempted to re-enlist in the Army. However, at 54 years of age, overweight, near-diabetic, and with evidence of arthritis, he was denied enlistment as a combat soldier. Instead, he was commissioned as a major in the Army Signal Corps. And he toured training camps and participated in bond drives in support of the war effort, usually paying his own travel expenses. General Matthew Ridgway later recalled that York created in the minds of farm boys and clerks the conviction that an aggressive soldier, well-trained and well-armed, can fight his way out of any situation. He also raised funds for war-related charities, including the Red Cross. He served on his county draft board, and when literacy requirements forced the rejection of large numbers of Fentress County men, he offered to lead a battalion of illiterates himself, saying they were crack shots. Although York served during the war as Signal Corps Major and as a colonel with the 7th Regiment of the Tennessee State Guard, newspapers continued to refer to him as Sergeant York. York had health problems throughout his life. He had gallbladder surgery in the late 1920s and had pneumonia in 1942. Described in 1919 as a red-haired giant with a ruddy complexion of the outdoors and standing more than 6 feet and tipping the scale at more than 200 pounds, by 1945, he weighed 250 pounds, and in 1948, he had a stroke. More strokes and another case of pneumonia followed, and he was confined to his bed from 1954. Further impaired by failing eyesight, he was hospitalized several times during the last 2 years. York died at the Veterans Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee on September 2, 1964, of a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 76. After a funeral service in his Jamestown church with General Matthew Ridgway representing President Lyndon Johnson, York was buried at the Wolf River Cemetery in Pall Mall. His funeral sermon was delivered by Richard G. Humble, General Superintendent of the Churches of Christ the Christian Union. Humble also preached Mrs. York's funeral sermon in 1984. York and his wife Gracie had 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, most named after American historical figures. An infant son in 1920 who died at 4 days, Alvin Callum Jr., George Edward Buxton, Woodrow Wilson, Samuel Houston, Andrew Jackson, Betsy Ross, Mary Alice, Thomas Jefferson, and an infant daughter in 1940 who died the same day she was born. Though he sought to downplay his battlefield exploits, he remains a war hero and example to others who sometimes must kill for the sake of their countrymen. Today's legacy in combat and education still lives on. Though a war hero, York wanted to be remembered as an educator focused on helping prepare future generations for an ever-changing world. The school he founded continues to educate children in Tennessee to this day. So that's about all for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, thank you for listening. You can follow me on social media under Poison Appalachia. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, Lemonade, TikTok, Blue Sky, and YouTube. If you could, on the podcast platform you listen to, could you please like and rate me and share me, please? Let's just keep letting everybody know about this podcast and keep growing. It's growing, just very slowly. But that's okay. I have some very loyal listeners, and I appreciate that. Thanks, y'all, and have a great week.